North Atlantic. Gray sky, gray water, the deck rolling under your feet. 2 ships are crossing this ocean. You are on one of them. You do not know which yet. But before this voyage ends, that answer will decide whether you come home alive. The first, a Royal Navy warship, 400 men below your feet, a trained surgeon, a medicine chest, 60 cannons, and the full weight of the British Empire behind every plank. The second, a Viking longship, 32 men on an open deck, no surgeon, no medicine, no written rules, dried fish, a barrel of sour beer, and an agreement between free men who chose to be here. One of these ships will lose most of its crew before the voyage ends, not to the enemy, to its own food, its own water, its own design. The other will bring nearly everyone home. This is a story about 2 systems that try to solve the same problem, keeping men alive at sea. And a number so devastating, it changes which one you think won. Here is the first number, and it is the one the Admiralty never wanted on the record. Between 1500 and 1800, an estimated 2 million sailors died of scurvy aboard European ships, more than storms, shipwrecks, enemy fire, and every other cause of death at sea combined. The Royal Navy, the most powerful maritime force in human history, contributed more to that number than any fleet afloat. And here is the second number. During the 7 Years' War, between 1756 and 1763, the Royal Navy enlisted roughly 184,000 men. Of those, 1,512 died in combat. The number lost to disease and desertion, 133,708. 90 men gone for everyone killed by the enemy. Those are Admiralty records, not estimates. Let that ratio sit for a moment. You are below deck on a British warship, 6th week out. The bread has things moving inside it. The water smells wrong. The man in the next hammock has not stood up in 2 days. Nobody can explain why. Not yet. Not for another 50 years. Anyone who has served where the food and water were someone else's decision understands what that does to a crew. You can handle danger. You can handle discomfort. What breaks people is the slow realization that the system keeping them alive does not actually prioritize it. 800 years earlier, Viking crews crossed the same waters with no surgeon, no empire behind them, and no medical knowledge of any kind. Open boats, cold provisions, and more often than not, they came home. Now, the Royal Navy won Trafalgar. It coordinated supply chains across 4 continents and ran the largest naval force the world had ever seen. These were not fools. The organizational intelligence behind that machine was extraordinary. But the machine was built to answer one question: how do we project force across oceans, design the ship around its cannons, fill it with men, control them, replace the ones you lose? The Vikings asked something else entirely. How do we bring everyone back? And the gap between those 2 questions is what killed 2 million men. Start with what went into a Royal Navy sailor's stomach every single day. 1 pound of hardtack, a biscuit baked from flour, water, and salt, built to survive years in storage. Sailors called them worm castles. After a few weeks at sea, weevil larvae colonized the bread from the inside. The workaround was to eat in the dark. Alongside that came salt beef or salt pork, preserved so long in brine it hardened beyond recognition. How hard! Sailors carved it into decorative boxes and buttons. Greenwich Museum still holds examples, artwork made from rations. Fresh water stored in wooden casks bred bacteria within weeks. The water turned green, then brown, then lethal. Dysentery from contaminated water killed more British sailors than cannon fire in nearly every major campaign of the century. And then came scurvy. In 1740, Commodore George Anson left England aboard HMS Centurion with roughly 1,900 men. 4 years later, fewer than 500 returned. Combat deaths, a handful. Their own provisions killed them before any enemy got the chance. 48 years after a surgeon named James Lind proved on HMS Salisbury that citrus cured scurvy, and nearly 2 centuries after Captain Lancaster demonstrated it in 1601. The Navy finally made citrus juice standard issue in 1795. That is not a gap in knowledge. That is a choice. Now cross to the Viking longship, and the difference hits immediately. Dried cod and stockfish, protein that keeps for months. Skyr, a fermented dairy thick enough to hold a spoon upright, whose acidity kills harmful bacteria on contact. Flatbread eaten fresh. And weak ale, brewed by boiling water with grain, which destroyed waterborne pathogens centuries before anyone understood why. They chose it for taste. What they got was sterilized drinking water by accident. A civilization with no medical theory and no laboratories kept its sailors healthier at sea than the empire that would later invent modern medicine. That alone is worth sitting with. But the real advantage was not any single provision. It was the rhythm of the voyage itself. Every day or two, the crew beached the longship. Over 200 documented landing sites stretch from Scandinavia to Newfoundland, roughly a day's sailing apart. Archaeological excavations at sites like Burka and Lonceau Meadows have uncovered food storage pits, grain remnants, and butchered animal bones, evidence that these stops were not improvised. They were planned logistics: fresh water from streams, foraged greens, waste dispersed into soil. Each landing was a biological reset built into the design of the voyage. Across the entire Viking Age, no large-scale scurvy crisis aboard Norse vessels has been documented. Short voyages, fresh provisions at every beaching, and fermented foods did what 2 centuries of Royal Navy surgeons could not. Not because the Norse understood microbiology, because their system never created the conditions for the disease to exist. How much of this was intentional? Some historians argue the Norse understood, through generations of observation, that certain provisions kept crews healthier. Others say it was practical coincidence. They preferred beer to water and dried fish to salted meat, and the health benefits followed by accident. The evidence supports both readings. Where do you stand on this? The food was killing them, but the men eating it had not chosen to be there in the first place, and that is the second link in the chain. A Royal Navy warship needed 400 men, mostly to operate the guns. Volunteers never met demand. So the Navy used press gangs, armed squads sweeping port cities after dark, seizing men from taverns and merchant vessels. Impressment was legal. You could be walking home from a pub on a Tuesday night and wake up on a warship bound for the Caribbean. In some ports, tavern keepers took part in a practice called crimping, working with naval agents to drug or deceive men into service. That was not exceptional. That was the system working as designed. And the scale tells you everything. Wartime required upwards of 120,000 men. Peacetime strength sat around 15,000. That gap was closed by force. And here is what that force cost. Every man who arrived in chains carried something aboard that no regulation could fix: the knowledge that he had never agreed to be there. Now stand on the other deck. Under the Viking laydown system, coastal districts maintained ships and crews for seasonal service. But nobody was seized at night. When a chieftain planned a voyage, he sent word through the district. In the sagas, men like Eric the Red went farm to farm, making their case personally, explaining where the expedition would go and what it stood to gain. This was recruitment by persuasion, not by force. A chieftain's reputation depended on the outcome of his last voyage. Lead well, bring men home with silver, and every farmer in the district would answer the next call. Lead badly, and nobody comes, and the terms made persuasion easy. Plunder, trade goods, and silver were divided among the entire crew. A chieftain took the largest share, but every oarsman received his portion. The sagas are full of men who joined voyages as farmhands and came home wealthy enough to buy land. Refusing a summons brought social shame, but it was not a crime. And the voyage had a known end. One summer season, not years of open-ended service. You knew when you were leaving, and roughly when you would return. Your family knew it too. In Britain's port cities, men hid from the press gang in cellars and attics to avoid being dragged to sea. In Scandinavia, men competed for limited spots on the next voyage out. Same ocean, same century. In one civilization, the sea was a sentence. In the other, it was an opportunity. You have dragged a man aboard. He does not want to be here. Now, you need him to obey. The cat o' nine tails, 9 knotted cotton cords, roughly 75 centimeters long, was the Navy's answer. In the Trafalgar era, the condemned sailor was ordered to make the instrument himself, spending 24 hours in leg irons braiding the cat that would be used on his own back. Penalties ran to 200 lashes for desertion, 300 for mutiny. Afterward, salt was applied to the wounds, the origin of the phrase we still use today, and the pay matched the treatment. Seamen's wages had been fixed in 1658. By 1797, that rate had not moved. In the time it took the Navy to approve one raise, Britain crowned 6 monarchs, fought half a dozen wars, and lost the American colonies. 139 years on the same shilling. On HMS Prince George in 1781, the admiral dined on roast duck, mutton, and tarts from Crystal. One deck below, sailors chewed weevil-infested biscuit. Same ship. 2 entirely different realities. Anyone who has served knows the difference. When the officer next to you eats what you eat, you follow that person through anything. When the hierarchy means separate meals and separate rules, something breaks. Not loudly. In the spaces between orders. On the Viking longship, the captain who called the voyage ate the same dried fish as the youngest oarsman. He slept on the same wet planks and faced the same North Atlantic spray. Discipline came from proximity, not punishment. On a vessel 30 meters long, every action was visible. Neglect your duties, and the crew knew before sundown. And here is a detail that rarely gets mentioned. When major decisions arose, whether to change course, whether to press on in dangerous weather, whether to raid or trade, the crew voted. The chieftain proposed. The men decided. 800 years before Spithead sailors had to mutiny just to be heard, Viking oarsmen had a voice built into the system. And when the system needed formal enforcement, it had the Thing, a public assembly where disputes were judged by peers. The consequences were real. Eric the Red, one of the most famous Norse explorers, was outlawed from both Norway and Iceland after killing 2 men. He was not imprisoned or flogged. He was erased, cut off from every community he belonged to. That exile drove him west and eventually led to the Norse settlement of Greenland. The harshest Viking punishment did not destroy a man's body. It destroyed his place in the world. When you put all of this together, rotten food, forced recruitment, savage discipline, there is one question left: what actually happened? The numbers in the next section answer it. A like helps more people find this kind of content. Everything in this video, the food, the recruitment, the discipline, produced a measurable result. And the measurement is simple: how many men stayed. The Royal Navy's annual desertion rate hovered around 1 in 4. During the American War of Independence, roughly 80,000 British sailors deserted. The Navy withheld 6 months' wages as a deterrent, and it barely made a difference. Men ran at the first port, the first foggy night, the first unguarded moment. These were not cowards. These were men whose own system gave them no reason to stay. The ship itself fed the problem. Men lived below the waterline where headroom could be under 5 feet, and hammocks hung 14 inches apart. Ventilation barely existed. And here is the thing about those conditions: nobody designed them to be cruel. They were simply what remained after the guns and powder took priority. The men got whatever space the weapons did not need. If you have ever worked inside a system that made you feel expendable, where the structure itself showed you that your well-being was nobody's priority, you understand the arithmetic every pressed sailor was running. That is not ancient history. I would be genuinely interested to hear your experience in the comments. Now look at the Gokstad ship, excavated in Norway and dated to around 890. 23 meters long, 5 wide, a draft of barely half a meter, open deck. Every man breathes the same air as the captain. The shallow draft meant the crew could beach on any shore and reset within minutes. No one lived below anything, because there was no below. Viking crews did not desert, because the conditions that produced desertion did not exist. The voyage lasted a single season. The risk was shared, the profit was divided. But perhaps the most telling evidence is this: the same men went back. Season after season, crews reformed voluntarily for new voyages. The sagas record men who sailed with the same chieftain for decades. That is not obedience. That is loyalty earned. You do not get repeat volunteers from a system that mistreats the people inside it. Picture 2 ships at anchor, side by side. On one, a man is calculating how to get off. On the other, a man is calculating his share of what comes next. That is the difference between a system that holds and a system that bleeds. April 1797, Spithead near Portsmouth. 16 warships of the Channel Fleet, the only force between Britain and French invasion, raised the red flag. Every ship, simultaneously. The demands were devastatingly reasonable. A pay increase, the first since 1658. Better provisions, medical care, shore leave. The sailors submitted formal petitions, maintained discipline, and harmed no officer. This was not chaos. It was organized resistance by men pushed past endurance. The Admiralty agreed. Pay was raised. Over 50 officers were dismissed. A royal pardon was issued. Weeks later, a second mutiny at the Nore went further. Richard Parker led an attempt to blockade the Thames. The government refused to negotiate. Parker was hanged from the yardarm of HMS Sandwich. That same year, the crew of HMS Hermione, driven to the breaking point by their captain's relentless discipline, seized the ship and sailed it to a Spanish port. The court-martial testimony survives. It is difficult reading. The Viking record contains nothing comparable, and not just because Norse leaders happen to be kinder. The Old Norse language has no word for mutiny. The concept did not exist because the system never created the conditions for it. Crews voted on decisions. Chieftains led by consent. Profit was shared. Service had a known end. A man who disagreed with the leadership did not need to seize a ship. He simply did not come back the following season. And a chieftain who lost his crew's trust did not face a mutiny. He faced an empty dock. That is not a system that needs a pressure valve. That is a system that never builds the pressure in the first place. Two systems, same ocean, same storms, same bacteria in the water and the bread. One built a machine that dominated the seas for 2 centuries. Trafalgar was real, the Empire was real, but the cost of operating that machine was paid in men. 2 million dead from a curable disease, a proven solution ignored for half a century. Pay frozen across 139 years. Crews dragged from their homes to serve inside ships designed around cannons, not people. The other built something quieter, a system where the crew was not an input but the point, where provisions preserved life instead of ending it, where discipline came from shared stakes rather than knotted rope, where the ship itself, open, light, beachable, served the men as much as the mission. No admiral designed the Viking system from above. No committee approved it. It grew from a simple principle. If the crew does not come home, there is no next voyage. Everything followed from that. If what you come here for is the real engineering, the decisions, the systems, the intelligence behind how people actually survived, this channel was built for exactly that. Subscribing means you will see what comes next. The Royal Navy built the most powerful fleet in history. The Vikings built the one that brought its men home.